I want you to think for a moment about how you might define yourself in terms of the products and brands you use and consume. So I'll use myself for an example. I have a strong preference for Diet Mountain Dew, Cherry Coke Zero, and Twinings tea. I'm a big fan of shopping at Costco and Trader Joe's. I use an Android smartphone and I own a PlayStation 5 video game console, and I'm also a huge fan of Lego. Now, I want you to take a moment and consider how odd all of that might be to someone 100 years ago. See, in the early days of mass marketing, branded products were seen as a way for manufacturers to communicate quality and consistency. They really weren't part of your personal identity. But today, branded items are so prevalent in society that you can tell a lot about a person just by examining the brands that are part of their lives. So, for example, let's say you meet a cool dude who's wearing a leather jacket and smokes cigarettes and drinks beer and has a sort of wild look in their eye. And after he hustles you at pool, he offers you a ride someplace. And as you walk out to the parking lot, you see three vehicles: a Toyota Prius, a Honda Odyssey minivan, and a Ford Mustang. Which car are you going to assume is his? Probably the Mustang, right? And the reason why is because the Mustang is a muscle car that's associated with guys who stand on the fringes of society. But if you met a geeky guy like me wearing a blue Oxford shirt and a pair of khakis and talking about data analysis, you probably wouldn't assume I'd be driving the Mustang. You'd probably pair me with the Prius, a good, cost-effective, socially conscious car, right? And if you met a woman who mentioned she has kids, you'd probably pair her with the minivan. Even though that's a completely irrational thing to do and probably not the assumption that you'd make with the cool guy or the geeky guy if they told you that they have kids too. So why would you do this? Well, it's partially because of stereotypes you've picked up from years and years of cultural conditioning, but it's also because we're all part of something called a culture of consumption, where our choices in what we use and consume play a shaping effect on our own self-image and also on the image others have of us. And there are subcultures where certain brands are so strong that just becoming a passionate user of a particular type of product qualifies you to be part of a select group of people. Some of the brands where you see this sort of behavior include things like Lululemon, Magic the Gathering, Jeep, Lego, and Red Bull. All of those things couldn't be more different from one another, and yet each has a core group of passionate fans who have built some part of their identity around these products. And they've all got Harley Davidson to thank for it. Now, wait a minute, hold on. You might be saying people wear Lululemon because of a bunch of outlaw bikers who ride really noisy motorcycles? And the answer is, yeah, sort of, but it's not exactly a cause and effect relationship. It's more of a situation where Harley Davidson stumbled onto something real. Some researchers wrote a classic paper about it, and marketers today can benefit from knowing about it. And so today, we're going to take a look at that paper and Harley Davidson as a brand and see what we can understand about subcultures of consumption. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this is the Marketing Gateway. So I'm going to take you back 30 years to 1995 when two researchers named John W. Schoten and James H. McAlexander published a landmark paper in the Journal of Consumer Research called Subcultures of Consumption: An Ethnography of the New Bikers. And let me just read the opening paragraph to you because this paper is absolutely amazing. So here goes. The most powerful organizing forces in modern life are the activities and associated interpersonal relationships that people undertake to give their lives meaning. In choosing how to spend their money and their time, people do not conform always or neatly to the ascribed analytic categories currently proffered by academia, like ethnicity, gender, age, vowels group, or social class. They take part in the creation of their own categories. As consumer researchers, we are uniquely positioned to identify and understand the organizing forces that people bring to their own lives through their consumption choices. In doing so, we discover subcultures of consumption. And then the authors explain that they spent 3 years conducting an ethnographic study where they embedded themselves in a motorcycle club made up mainly of Harley Davidson owners and tried to understand what it meant to be part of a subculture of consumption. And when I put this in front of my students, I often joke that this must have seemed like a really good way for two academics to justify joining a motorcycle club. Hey, it's for research! But they uncovered something really cool in this paper, and I'm going to do my best to summarize it here for you. So first of all, let's understand that while Harley Davidson is a popular American motorcycle brand that's associated with the sort of rugged, muscular, fringe of society bikers you might see on a show like maybe Sons of Anarchy, Bikers have not historically identified themselves with this brand specifically. Though Harley-Davidson is one of the oldest and most recognizable motorcycle brands, it went through a period in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s where it was seen as being anti-competitive, outdated, and a maker of expensive but unreliable bikes, especially in comparison to the Japanese bikes that were being produced at the same time. Bikers would actually call them Hardly Ableson or Hardly Drivable. But in the 1980s, the brand was acquired by a new group of owners who completely rebuilt it with new manufacturing techniques, better quality controls, retro looks built on modern designs, and, quite famously, a wider profile typified by the Fat Boy heavyweight bike. The 1990s kicked off an era of peak demand for Harley-Davidson, leading to a class of riders the authors of this paper referred to as the New Bikers. And many of their research subjects were part of the Harley-Davidson Owners Group, also known as HOG. The researchers themselves, however, started off as outsiders who didn't own motorcycles and who even had a bit of fear of both bikes and bikers as they attended a Sturgis rally in 1990 and began to dip their toe into biker culture. About a year into the study, each author bought a motorcycle, a BMW for one and a Honda for the other, before one of them eventually acquired a used Harley in 1992, and both of them wound up buying new Harleys later that fall and joining the Harley Owners Group themselves. Their transition from outsiders to wannabes to true Harley riders is part of what makes their paper so captivating. But the researchers were also cognizant that they were eventually committing that cardinal sin of anthropology and ethnography, going native, and becoming so much like their research subjects that they lost all objectivity. In the paper, the researchers defined the subculture of consumption as having some key hallmarks, such as dressing like outlaw bikers in the biker uniform, and becoming highly committed to Harley-Davidson motorcycles specifically. They also noticed that there were many different groups of riders within this subculture, from evangelistic Christians to recovering addicts to lesbian motorcyclists to rich urban bikers to working class families. One of the most interesting aspects of this subculture of consumption were the aspirants, people who couldn't afford to own a Harley-Davidson bike but who dress in Harley apparel and talk about owning a Harley one day. But another aspect was the near religious transformation the subculture members would undergo, describing their Harley riding in terms that equated their experience to transcendental meditation, magical flight, or group consciousness. The brotherhood of fellow riders was a key part of the culture too, and calling one another bro or brother was an element of outlaw culture that carried over to the subculture of consumption. The bike itself was treated as an almost sacred object. The researchers noted that touching someone else's bike without permission was an incredible taboo. And there were even rituals around cleaning and maintenance, and many bikers would even build shrines to Harley-Davidson in their garages to go along with their bikes. The authors also identified several characteristics prevalent in the subculture of consumption, such as personal freedom, patriotism, American heritage, and, of course, machismo. Towards the end of the paper, the researchers tied this all to marketing and suggested that marketers could learn a few things from the subculture of consumption by themselves learning about the ethos, language, and social mores and taboos of their own brand subcultures. The key, the authors said, was in trying to find a way to broaden the subculture to make it accepting of mainstream consumers without alienating the hardcore members or diluting the subculture itself. In the case of Harley-Davidson, and the expense and exclusivity of owning an actual Harley-Davidson bike gave the Harley Owners Group members a sense of superiority and the worship and adoration of outsiders. That helped to focus attention inward towards owning the actual product rather than outward towards those who simply bought the merchandise and expressed an affinity for the brand. Now, one reason this paper is so important is because it challenges the traditional methods of segmentation often used in marketing, demographics, psychographics, vals, and cohorts, and things like that. It also doesn't try to identify personas within a broad market, but rather defines the market by affinity for the product and the brand. Even 30 years later, this paper is still very relevant and useful for thinking about how brand loyalists can be defined and understood. And even with all the information and technology we have today, it's still very common for marketers to reveal that the true secret to success is in understanding their customers. I've included a link to the paper in the show notes, and I highly recommend that you read it. Don't be put off by the fact that it's a journal article. It's an easy read and quite enjoyable. And you might be surprised at what you learn. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this has been The Marketing Gateway. See you next time. Today's plug is for fiction, and for a very specific reason. You might have seen a piece circulating on social media from The Times in London this week. It's in response to the death of Tom Stoppard, a British playwright who passed away on November 29th this year. His obituary ran in the Times on December 1st. On December 2nd, the following letter ran in the Times. Sir, in 1993, my wife and I went to see the first production of Arcadia by Tom Stoppard, and in the interval, I experienced a Damascene conversion. This, by the way, is a reference to the Christian figure Saul of Tarsus having a vision from Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus and becoming Paul the Apostle. The letter goes on to explain that the writer is someone who studied breast cancer, and it continues. In the first act of Arcadia, Thomasina asks her tutor, Septimus, if there is an equation for a curve like a bell, there must be an equation for one like a bluebell, and if a bluebell, why not a rose? With that, Stoppard explains chaos theory, which better explains the behavior of breast cancer. At the point of diagnosis, the cancer must have already scattered cancer cells into the circulation that nest latent and distant organs. The consequence of the hypothesis was the birth of adjuvant systemic chemotherapy, and rapidly we saw a striking fall of the curve that illustrated patient's survival. Stoppard never learnt how many lives he saved by writing Arcadia. Signed, Michael BAUM, Professor Emeritus of Surgery, Visiting Professor of Medical Humanities, University College, London. And, I would add, one of the key clinicians at the forefront of international breast cancer clinical trials. And this is why fiction matters. It might seem like make-believe, but it allows us to access the thoughts of others and to play make-believe for a little while and to try to understand the world from their points of view. If you read or write or even stage fiction for a broader audience, you're doing the world a service you may never realize. So, thank you.